Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Center for Independent Studies. My name is Benjamin Herskovich, and I'm a policy analyst here. Looking around this packed room, it is fairly clear that our distinguished guest this evening needs absolutely no introduction whatsoever. However, I will do exactly that and introduce him anyway. Tonight we have the honor of hosting Dr. Daniel Pipes. He's a world-renowned Middle East expert and is currently president of the Middle East Forum and Taube Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford University. His articles regularly appear in the world's most influential newspapers. He has served the US government in 2 positions, including 2 presidentially appointed positions, and has appeared on leading television networks around the globe, including the BBC and Al Jazeera. This description is just the beginning of his list of achievements. Clearly, the full list is as intimidating as it is long. Before going on, I would like to thank the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, AJAC, for bringing Dr. Pipes to Australia. You've no doubt heard enough from me. Before we begin, by way of housekeeping, this event will be filmed, and as a result, if you do not want to appear on the CIS website, it is better to avoid asking a question. Dr. Pipes will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and then we will have a very generous hour or so of questions and answers. This means that the event tonight will finish at 7:30 instead of the advertised 7:15. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Pipes to the stage.
Thank you, Benjamin, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be back at the CIS, and I thank Greg Lindsay and the staff for making it possible for me to be here. As usual, the Middle East is hopping, and what I thought I'd do in my opening remarks is to comment briefly on a variety of topics, give a tour d'horizon in 4 groupings of 2 each. So I have 8 topics in 15 minutes, and shall try to go through them expeditiously. The first, of course, is Egypt, where we've just seen the dramatic step by the newly elected president, where he dismissed the defense minister. That might, in most contexts, not seem like such a major change, but the Minister of Defense, Mohammed Tantawi, has been in effect the ruler of Egypt for the last year and a half since Mubarak was overthrown in February of 2011. And Morsi, the newly elected president, has been a president without any powers. The military, which Tantawi heads, made sure that before the elections took place in June, that the presidency was stripped of all powers. So Morsi has been something of a figurehead in his first month in office, and Tantawi has continued to rule. Suddenly we learn that Tantawi is elevated to a ceremonial position as a counselor to the president. In other words, he's out of a job. The newspaper reports, it's only a few hours old, suggests that this is a fait accompli, a matter that ends the topic, and we are now in a new era. I would say not so fast. I would say that the changes that have taken place in Egypt since January of 2011 are still in flux and in process, and that we have not heard the last of the military, and it's not likely that the military, which has been ruling Egypt as a corporate entity now for 60 years, since the revolution of 1952, that the military will go quietly to the night. So this is an important step, but it's not the last step. I can't predict to you what's next, but I would be surprised if the military does not make a strenuous effort to retain its control over Egypt. Secondly, Syria. The developments in Syria, also since early 2011, have been dramatic, have led to some estimated 20,000 deaths, have brought in surrounding countries, have led to a major confrontation between some of the ethnic communities of Syria. Again, we're very much in the middle of things, and it's hard to see how they will come out. But a couple of thoughts. First, the Sunni majority, Arabic-speaking Sunni majority of Syria has been repressed for close to half a century and is getting its vengeance now. And it's a cruel vengeance. It could be a far more ugly one in the future, with a potential genocide against the Alawi people who have been dominating Syria during this period. The Islamists dominate, those Muslims who want to apply Islamic law in its entirety, dominate the opposition and are likely to dominate a future regime in Syria. The Assad government is likely to fall. It's hard to see how it will not fall. The question is how long it can last, how long it will control the weapons of mass destruction, in particular the chemical weapons, how many refugees will be fleeing to other countries, what the implications are for other countries. For example, if one looks at Turkey and Syria, there are two ethnic groups that, well, not quite that. There's one ethnic group, the Kurds, that are on both sides of that border, and then there are the Alawis, or properly pronounced the Alawis, of Syria, and the Alevis of Turkey, who have the same name, pronounced differently in Arabic and Turkish, but are in fact different religious communities. And yet, because of the tensions between the two countries, they have in a sense found each other. And the Alevis of Turkey are upset that the government of Turkey is helping in opposition to the Alawites of Syria. It gets very complicated very fast. This is, I think, an extremely important battleground where, for example, the Iranian and Turkish Islamists who worked together in the past decade are now finding themselves on opposite sides of the battle lines in Syria, with the Iranians supporting the Assad regime and the Turks against it. I foresee much anarchy in the country. I foresee a violent regime. I foresee that the ugliness of the Assad brutal dictatorship will look minor in retrospect once we see what this new regime will look like. Third, Iran. Iran is the outstanding problem of the Middle East and perhaps of the world, as the Iranian regime is dead set on acquiring nuclear weapons. This is not something new. North Korea has nuclear weapons, Pakistan, China, Russia. What's different about Iran is that the leadership has an apocalyptic mindset. It believes the end of days are nigh, and believes that the way to bring that end of days upon us is through anarchy. And what better way to foment anarchy than atomic weaponry? And therefore the likelihood that these weapons in the hands of the Iranian leadership would be deployed is far greater than the case of any other state that I mentioned, and therefore of a magnitude greater danger than any other state. And therefore the alarm is far greater, in particular in Israel, where the Iranian regime has been clear that it wants to eradicate the Jewish state, but not just in Israel, certainly in Saudi Arabia and many other Middle Eastern states as well. It is my presumption that the Iranian government will do everything possible to acquire nuclear weapons, that it will pay whatever price is necessary, much as the North Korean regime did a few years ago, including starvation, but it will get those nuclear weapons. The only way to stop it is not through economic sanctions. I doubt through computer viruses or assassinations, though those are useful in stymieing the regime. But in the end, it's a question of using force to destroy some of the nuclear infrastructure or not. There are many unpleasant implications of using force, including the Iranian population being in solidarity with its regime, including threats against the supply of oil and gas through the Straits of Hormuz, terrorism, and other nasty implications. However, I think all of those pale in contrast to the possible prospect of the Iranian regime controlling nuclear weapons. And therefore, I personally am in favor of using force to stop the Iranians. Now, using force implies using force repeatedly, in part because it's unlikely that the real basic elements of the nuclear infrastructure can be reached because they're far underground, in part because even if they can be, the Iranians have the means and the skills to rebuild. And so if one uses force, one has to be ready to use force and again and again. I take with some reservations the news that comes out of Washington and Jerusalem on what is happening and what the developments are. For example, just a couple of days ago, there was a major broadcast on Channel 2 in Israel arguing that the Netanyahu government has decided in favor of using force against Iran. And it has compelling arguments, to be sure, a carefully done documentary. But my response is interesting if true. Who knows if this is really what the Netanyahu government has decided, or whether this is something the Netanyahu government wants the Iranians to hear. We, after all, are not really the intended audience. It is the Iranians. Who knows what the Iranians are saying and doing? I think there's a great deal of disinformation. I don't think we'll really understand what's taking place in these crucial days until 5-10 years from now, when the story comes out. So we on the outside don't really know what's going on. And I would take with a grain of salt anybody who tells you that the Obama administration will not do anything. If they know, they're not talking. And if they do talk, they don't know. So it is a potentially very great crisis with many implications, but we just don't know what's taking place. Comparably, in 1981, when the Israelis attacked the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq, we didn't know what was going on until it happened. Should this crisis be dealt with successfully, I have high hopes for Iran, because I see the population as disaffected from the Islamist government that rules it, and open to learning and emulating the West. And in that respect, the Iranian population is unlike any other Muslim population in the world. It's the one place in the world where radical Islamism is not making progress. It is, in fact, doing very badly. So Iran is both, on one hand, the greatest danger and the greatest hope for the region. Turkey, in contrast, which has been historically for decades now a major Western ally from Korea to Afghanistan, has changed. It's changed very much for the worse. It's a major country in terms of population, strategic location, economic growth, but it is increasingly a hostile country, both in terms of its foreign policies, its domestic policies, and the popular opinion, which is deeply anti-Western. And I believe that there will be a switch, that Iran, which is the crisis state today, will be all right, and Turkey, which is the perceived ally, indeed, by our governments, will, in fact, be the hostile and problematic state of the region. Third pair of two is Iraq and Afghanistan, where the West cumulatively has put in enormous resources and spent many lives. And yet, I think, in both cases, the future is bleak. These countries are reverting to type, and the great efforts we made are being undone. There was a story just a couple of days ago in the Australian press about Kandahar and the American-built electricity supply, and how all sorts of industry has begun on the basis of this, and how that's pushed the Taliban back, and what a great piece of news this is, except for the fact the American military is leaving in some months, and the subvention for the electric power plant will disappear with them. Electricity will diminish severely, and the industries will be closed, and that's the end of it. And I think that's symbolic of the larger effort that the American-led effort has led to, which is a set of structures both in Iraq and Afghanistan that are built on our money and our discipline, our security. And when we take that away, little bit will be left. I suspect that in 5-10 years, return to Iraq and Afghanistan, you'll see little imprint of the Western efforts. And finally, on policy, when one looks at the Middle East, it's pretty bleak. It's a fight in most places between the brutal dictators, such as Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and the Islamist ideologue extremists, such as the Free Syrian Army in Syria. Not a very tempting choice. I would say we should stay away from that fight. We should not support one side against the other. We don't want to support, say, Assad and his brutality and venality, nor should we support the Islamists, who are going to be, should they come to power, even more hostile to us and even more brutal to their own population than Assad. So we should stay away. We should not get involved. I rue the fact that our governments are helping the rebels against the government. I think it's an unwise thing, both from the practical point of view, in that we are helping our even more dedicated enemies, and from the moral point of view, and that we will be complicit in whatever regime follows, and we don't want to be. Instead, I think we should follow a three-pronged policy. One is always to support the liberal, modern, secular Facebook element in the Middle East, which it does exist, which is most similar to us in outlook, which is far from the power centers, which is not going to be taking over in any country soon, but ultimately, some decades perhaps, has a possibility of coming to power and is the hope for the region. And we should always support them. We should be true to them. They look to us, and we should respond in the right way. Secondly, we should always oppose the Islamists. Whether they be terroristic or working through the system, they are our enemy. They are the heirs of the fascists and communists of yesteryear. They are the radical utopians who seek to create a new world order that is inhumane and antithetical to all we believe in. They are the enemy. They must always be opposed. Which leaves, thirdly, the dictators, who are greedy, brutal, nasty, but who are, in many places, in power. And what we should do with them is to work with them and to push them to open their societies, to apply the rule of law, to allow freedom of speech, to have political participation over a long term. So this would mean, for example, in the case of the Assad dynasty, or better yet, the Mubarak rule in Egypt, which is 30 years long, to keep pressing them to open up slowly, carefully, modestly, but always to go in the right direction, which we did not do. And best of all, that would be done in a coordinated fashion by Western states. Finally, just a couple words about the American political process, and in particular, the choosing of Paul Ryan as vice president candidate for the Republican Party. I think what we've seen in recent years is a increasing division between Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, and liberals on these issues, in particular Israel. Note that I haven't mentioned Israel until now. Israel has been somewhat pushed aside. One always started with Israel, the Arab-Israel conflict. But today it's not. And yet, from a political point of view, from a domestic politics point of view, in the United States, Israel is the issue. And other issues, be it Syria or Iran, are often seen through the prism of policy towards Israel. So Israel is politically what counts. And on the topic of Israel, one sees an increasing bifurcation of the two parties. Whereas 15, 20 years ago, they were roughly the same. Today, they're not. As poll after poll shows, when asked a question along the lines of, do you support Israel or the Arabs, 85, 90% of conservative Republicans say Israel. 75% of Republicans at large say Israel. 60% of independents say Israel. 50% of Democrats say Israel. And 35% of liberal Democrats say Israel. So it's a linear scale with the most conservative, the most supportive of Israel, and the most liberal, the least supportive of Israel. And so what one sees as these campaigns develop in the next 3 months is a signaling to each of the camps that the topic of Israel is to be consistent with the liberal or conservative wings of the Democratic or Republican parties. And so someone like Paul Ryan, who doesn't have a leading position on these issues, nor does Mitt Romney, is sure to insist on the emotional, political, security support of Israel. Mitt Romney went to Israel just a couple of weeks ago and made a powerful emotional statement in Jerusalem about U.S.-Israel relations. He's not winning any new votes. He is assuring conservative Republicans, Republicans at large, that this is an issue that's important to him. Barack Obama stays away from this issue, stays away from Israel, stays away from any kind of emotional statement. He does do what he has to do, but he doesn't do it with any kind of warmth, signaling to his constituency that he keeps his distance from Israel. So what we see in the United States now, as is reflected in other countries as well, including Australia, is an increasing diversity between, distance between the policies of the parties. And Israel, I think, will suffer from this. Israel is best off if there is a bipartisan consensus, and that is fraying in the United States as it is elsewhere. So with that, let me conclude my quick tour d'horizon. Not sure if I made it in 15 minutes, but I did my best. And